Hello everybody and welcome to this EduSat session. Let me begin by introducing myself. I am Dr. Neera Singh from the Faculty of English and I am the course coordinator of the elective English course EEG-5, Understanding Prose. Now, I hope all of you have gone through at least once this complete course and are more or less familiar with what we have taught you in this course. But just to be sure, I'll quickly go through a absolutely micro picture of this course and what it entails. This course is divided into two parts. In the first part, we've taught you the various varieties of prose, and in the second part, we have spoken about forms of prose. Now, the first three blocks of this course are devoted to descriptive prose, narrative prose, and expository prose. That's blocks 1, 2, and 3. And after that, in blocks 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, we have taken you through the various forms of prose, which are the short story, which is what my session today will primarily focus on. Then in block 5 and in block 6, we have taken up the novel as a prose form. In block 7, we have taught you the essay. And in block 8, we have dealt with biography and autobiography. So basically, in a nutshell, this is what we've covered in the course EEG-5. Now, today, as I said, my session will concentrate on the short story, which is block 4 of your course. And the stories that we have taken up for detailed study are 4 in number. The first is Javni by Raja Rao. The second is The Lost Child by Mulk Raj Anand. The third is A Cup of Tea by Catherine Mansfield. And the fourth is After 20 Years by O. Henry. Now, besides actually teaching you these stories, we have also spoken to you about the basic characteristics of a short story, the basic elements of a short story, and we've also talked about the rise and development of the short story. You all must be aware that this was a form which attained perfection in the 19th century. And we've also spoken about, issues like how short is a short story, how is it different from a novel or a novella, how is it different from a tale, how is it different from a parable, how is it different from various other forms of prose. All right. And besides this, we've also discussed the very basic elements and characteristics of a short story, which are plot, character, time and place, style, technique, and narration. I'll be speaking at length about these 5 or 6 characters. But before we go on, let us address the very fundamental question, and that is, what is a short story? Let's try and define what a short story is. Whenever we see a short story, and I'm sure that all of you must have read hundreds of short stories, whether from the point of view of studying it or whether from the point of view of enjoyment or basic reading, we all have read short stories. And when we see a short story, we recognize it as such. But when we come to the core of defining a short story, there the problem arises. Now, and why is that? Because there are so many different kinds of short stories that there is no single definition that can cover them all. For example, let's take in very general terms a very fundamental definition of a short story. A short story is a piece of prose fiction, complete in itself and of moderate length. Now, this is a very general definition, but even in this one sentence, there arise a number of problems. When we speak of it being a prose fiction. It eliminates anything that is written in verse. So, if we take the example of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, I hope we are familiar with the Canterbury Tales. They are a closely knit series of short stories, but we do not call them short stories because they have been written in verse. So, by the process of elimination, Canterbury Tales, even though they are stories, cannot be taken as a short story. Then, when we come to length, we are faced with another problem, because what is the average length of a short story? We said moderate length, but how does one establish a moderate length? You know, for example, here I'd like to share with you a short story which is very, very famous, but I'll leave it up to you to say whether because of its length it is a short story or it isn't. Now listen to this story. I was on a train from London to Edinburgh. There was a man seated across the aisle from me. Do you believe in ghosts? He asked. No, I said. He vanished. Now this is a short story because there is a plot, there is a sequence of events, it is in prose, it is not in verse, but I leave it up to your imaginations to see whether you would call it a short story or you wouldn't call it a short story, right? Now, that is the definition of a short story. Now, as far as it being different from a tale is more or less oral in nature, while a short story can be in the written form. Then, a fable. How is a short story different from a fable? A fable conveys a moral, and basically the characters in it are animals. Then how is it different from a parable? A parable always conveys a moral, whereas a short story may or may not convey a moral. All right, and of course, by its very length, it is different from a novel. So, to conclude this definition, we can say that an effective short story should arouse and hold the interest of the listener, and it must convey a sense of completion and in a style that suits the content of the story. All right. Now, there should also be plot, as I said before. Plot is a sequence of events which should be interrelated, and it should have a kind of unity or a wholeness or a completeness. Then there should be characters who should be differentiated from each other by their various traits. The story should be set in a particular time and a particular place. All right. Then there should be a particular style that binds the story together. And this style can be achieved by a selection of words and ideas which we call literary devices, and we've already taught you these literary devices in block 1 of our course. Then there should also be a kind of technique or narration in a short story, because you know some short stories begin with the plot and fit the characters in it, or some begin with character and choose incidents and develop them along the way. All right. So all these characteristics and elements have to be borne in mind whenever you read a short story, and in order to be able to appreciate a short story, in order to be able to study it rather than merely reading it, you must keep the framework of all these elements: plot, character, time and place, style, technique, narration. You must build your story within this framework. All right. And at this point of time, I must reiterate that you all would benefit greatly by reading Unit 14 of Block 4, because in that unit we have in a very comprehensive manner dealt with all the characteristics of a short story, the basic elements, and what constitutes a good short story. So do take my advice and read Unit 14, because that would really help you immensely. Okay. So now let me go on to the main body of my work, and what I want to speak to you primarily today is certain innovations in style that have come up in the form of a short story. Traditionally speaking, when we speak of a traditional short story, there are certain elements that we associate with the story. They are realism, theme, sociological or psychological importance, meaning, and length. But in recent times, now these were elements of a traditional short story. But in recent times, many changes have come about in style, and this is what I want to discuss today. Now, stories these days are in the form of experimental stories. Now, you may ask, what are the elements that constitute an experimental story? Now, well, some of these can be the presence of an anti-hero, the presence of an anti-plot, the presence of an open-ended narration. You know, like I said before, traditional short stories had a hero, had a plot, and had a narration which sort of tied up in a neatly tied up package in the end. But experimental stories now, mostly the modern and postmodern stories, have reversed all these trends. So when we talk of an experimental story, we tend to look for either an anti-hero instead of a hero, an anti-plot instead of a traditional plot, or an open-ended narration. Okay, now let's take each one of these as it existed before and as it is prevalent now. Let's take up anti-hero. A short story is basically the depiction of human character or human condition as a particular writer sees it. Consequently, it has to have character apart from the events that happen to it. Therefore, every short story writer has to choose characters with great care. He has to build the character with great care so as to make it realistic to the readers. And he also has to develop the characters so that they are in harmonious development with the rest of the story and with the rest of the characters that they come into conflict with. Now, traditionally, when we talk of a hero in a traditional story or a character, what is it that comes to mind? Just think of it. We are used to having heroes of noble stature. We are used to having larger than life characters, you know, of the Greek tragedies, of the Roman sagas, for that matter of our Hindi film fraternity. We have heroes like Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra who are, you know, who can bash up people, 20 people with just their bare hands. So that is what the traditional hero or the protagonist was like. But in this day and age, this kind of grandness of character is slightly dubious, if not downright comic. Because in these days, wars can be triggered by the press of a button, by the push of a button. And, all that kind of, macho man kind of an appeal no longer holds good. In fact, I must share with you a Bruce Lee film that I saw in which these warriors are faced with an American gentleman and they are in a conflict with him, and these warriors take on this tremendous stance that these kung fu karate types take up, with all the war cries and their fists, sort of the warlike cries and their stances, and this American hero just whips out a pistol from his pocket and shoots the warriors. So that is the kind of thing that is available in our century today. And so this kind of heroism has become slightly dubious. I wouldn't say it's completely out, but it is slightly dubious. So this kind of a hero did not fulfill the expectations of a reader, and they started looking for something else. And so if you notice this trend, that even in our TV serials now, for that matter, the first Hindi TV soap opera, Hum Log and Bunyad, they had characters, and Nukkad, these were the initial TV serials, they had characters which were down to earth. In that sense, they were even losers, but they formed the main basis of the serials. Then, as far as English serials are concerned, we have American serials like Friends, in which there are these 6 friends who are absolutely average, down to earth characters with average emotions, petty jealousies, you know, all the kind of emotions that we also have, and that is why we are better able to identify with them. Then we have the in literature we have plays like Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller, in which Willy Loman is an average salesman, and he is the protagonist of the play, and a very rich and interesting play has been woven around his life. All right. So the reversal of larger than life, the reversal of noble and proud, and the reversal of unidimensional, because a character also we have come to realize is never unidimensional. It is not, you know, in that sense doesn't have just one single trait in him. You can be good at a certain point of time, but there is also elements of bad in a person. So this unidimensional character was also comic, and so this also got reversed. All right. So this was the anti-hero that has come into modern times. Now when we come to anti-plot, what happened in a traditional story? Plot referred to a sequence of events which make up a narrative. In fact, the very early storytellers were not bothered with issues like form or various styles of narration. They simply told a tale. You know, once upon a time this happened, and in a chronological way they went about telling their tale. The plot and the chronology coexisted side by side. But when stories came to be recorded in print, and therefore the form of a story, the shape of a story became a serious consideration. Whereas earlier writers thought the plot and story were the same thing, for a seasoned writer this was not so. Because a seasoned writer was not trying to show you in a story how B follows A, how C follows B, how D follows C, and so on and so forth. That was not his intention. His intention was to present a deep insight into human character or human condition. All right. And the traditional plot, having a beginning, a middle, and an end, also became became far too patterned and far too old-fashioned to be able to project the complexity of modern day life. Okay, so there were and also there were new researches into science and technology. There were new researches into in-depth psychology, and also there were complexities and several new insights being presented into human nature, which all had to be recorded. And so seasoned writers started trying to show all this in their stories. So there were many different ways of now telling a story. Okay, now in the experimental story, this thing of plot was also changed because of the stream of consciousness that seasoned modern day writers tried to present. Because when they were delving into human character, they realized that the stream of thoughts of a human being do not carry on in a linear fashion, in a chronological fashion. You know, at times we are thinking of one thing and suddenly new ideas impinge into the mind. We go back to thinking of, say, problem A, but then we go on to problem B, and in the middle there might be something totally different that comes in. So this is what writers were trying to project. So again, instead of the plot, we got the anti-plot, which was reversal of linear chronology, reversal of beginning, middle, and end, and the viewpoint became more important, and the stream of consciousness started getting projected. All right. Next we go on to the narration part of a story, and we talk about open-ended narratives, and which were the reversal of a neat ending, and there was complete ignorance of what happens next. Now, what is narration? In its broadest sense, it relates to a sequence of events. It involves a conflict and a resolution of this conflict. And alongside it, it also has elements such as character, settings, description, and so on and so forth. The effort is to invoke the interest of the reader and to sustain the interest of the reader. And for an example, if you want an example of a very good narrative, it is our very own epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. And these two epics are what constitutes a narrative. Okay. Now, plot. What is plot? Plot involves the notion of arranging into a pattern. Let me illustrate this by giving you an example. The king died and the queen died is a story. But what is the plot? The king died and the queen died of grief. That is a plot. And now what is the difference between plot and a story? In the plot, there is a cause and effect situation. The king died and the queen died of grief. That makes it into a plot. Alright. So, plot implies a cause and effect relationship between events, whereas a story merely tells us what happens. Alright. Now, I mentioned this before also, that the short story as an art form developed and reached perfection in the 19th century. And we have had a host of wonderful writers who have given us a number of short stories, like Anton Chekhov in Russia. We have our own Munshi Premchand in India. We have Guy de Maupassant and a whole lot of others who gave us absolute classical short stories. But what happens is that when any form of art reaches perfection, then people do tend to experiment with new forms. They do tend to try and find new ways of presenting the same things. And that is exactly what happened with the short story as well. And that is when open-ended narratives came in. Because people had got so used to, the beginning, the middle, and then the end, where all the conflicts were tied up neatly into a package, that people started expecting that. Even if you look back at the films of the 60s or 70s, this is what happened. We used to have a hero, we used to have a heroine, even though there was a bit of conflict in the middle, even though a villain came up, we almost subconsciously knew when we went to see a film that the hero would get the heroine, he would surmount all the problems, whether it was family or society or the villain, he would surmount them all, and he would eventually be successful in winning over the heroine. The villain would meet a bad end because he was bad, and that was it. So that kind of expectation came into short stories as well. Very, very predictable the plot became. But then the masterminds of the short story started experimenting with this kind of neatly tied up ending. They started leaving open endings. They started leaving various interpretations. They started leaving the story to various interpretations, and they started leaving them to the reader's imagination as to what could have happened, and not necessarily this happened after that. Alright. So the open-ended story could begin in the middle of the tale, and the conclusion would not be stated clearly, and the reader would be left to infer the meaning or to interpret it in his or her own way. And sometimes there would not even be a conclusion. I mean, and the reader could take it as it was and interpret it however he wanted. Alright. So it was as if the author was saying that I am presenting certain events to you. They may not necessarily be in a sequence, or they may be, and it is for you to understand them, to make of them as you will. Okay. So we see that anti-plot, anti-hero, and open-ended narratives have taken over from the traditional concept of hero, well-ordered plot, and a neatly tied-up ending. So what I'm basically getting at is that the short story form as we know it and as we have been used to has undergone many changes. And the literary expectations that the word story now evokes have either been abandoned or they have been modified to such a large extent that they are open to various interpretations. And sometimes it even becomes difficult for us to apply the term story to a piece of literature. I'll give you an example of this. You know, I've already mentioned before that a traditional short story had characteristics like realism, theme and subject. You know, realism meant that fiction writers of the 19th century tried to portray the world as realistically as possible. Characters, situations, events, and all the paraphernalia surrounding them, such as manners, morals, dress, furniture, all of this conformed to the realistic code that was present at that period of time. Then, as far as the theme and subject was concerned, the themes also related to either the sociological condition of that time, or the psychological condition of that time, or historical, economic, political condition of that time. So it more or less depicted that condition. Then as far as the meaning was concerned, the short story writers felt that the story must have a meaning. It must mean something to the readers, from which the readers could either draw some kind of moral lesson, or at least something which reflected their meaning of their lives. Okay. Then length, as I've already spoken before, there was a short story was considered to be of moderate length. But like I said before, recent writers have demolished all these characteristics, and now what do we have? We have anti-realism, anti-subject, anti-meaning, and anti-length. Because when life became more and more complicated, when realism started taking a back seat, then the realistic way of presenting a picture was no longer valid. It was no longer adequate. In fact, the inner recesses of the mind became more important. Correct? So, for example, let me quote from a story by C. Radhakrishnan. The story is called The Bear, and it's a Malayalam story. And during the course of the story, the reader is left to infer the meaning, because actually the image of the bear is first confused with the image of the man, and then with the image of the narrator's father. So at the end of the story, one is actually left wondering as to what it is that the writer is actually trying to depict. So this is anti-realism. An example of anti-subject or anti-theme that I am speaking about, you can think of Don Quixote or Arabian Nights, because what happens is that the opening chapter of even the Mahabharata, let me give you an example from the Mahabharata, where Ganesh breaks his pencil but uses his tusk instead to write, can be cited as a point, because here the author is sort of telling you to get into the story with him, to suspend his judgment of realism, and to go along with the writer where he intends to take you. Then there is another story which is by Awadh Narayan Singh. The story is called Intimate, which can hardly be paraphrased, because more than being a story of an encounter between two strangers, it is nothing more. Okay. Then there are stories like Games. There is a story which is completely anti-meaning. It has no meaning. Then there are stories which do not lend themselves to interpretations or analysis. And this is Michael Goldstein's The Self-Contained Compartment. And I must share one story with you. If you have a look at your monitors, this story is by Russell Edison, and the way you're looking at the story is what this story is all about. Russell Edison's Father, Father, What Have You Done? By Russell Edison. A man straddling the apex of his roof cries, "Giddy up." The house rears up on its back porch, and all its bricks fall apart, and the house crashes to the ground. His wife cries, "Father, Father, what have you done?" Now, can you imagine? This is a complete story in itself. It's a postmodern story, where the structure, where the plot, where the narration, where the characters have been demolished completely, and it's left for the reader's judgment, the reader's interpretation, to make of it what you will. Now, as far as we are concerned with our study material, this story is a bit extreme. It's on the other side of the fence. So let's not go completely into that. But why I've spoken about all these innovations and experiments is because you must be made aware that any writing can be variously interpreted. You must bear this fact in mind when you approach your study material and start reading the short stories prescribed in your course. The writer may have meant one thing, but you as readers can infer any kind of meaning depending upon your interpretation, your mindset, the place that you are in at that particular phase of time. Now, let's go back to the stories that we've taken up in your course. Let's look at The Lost Child. It can be variously interpreted. The surface meaning of this very evocative story is very simple. A child has been taken to the fair by his parents, and looking at the sights and sound of the fair, the child is completely engrossed and overcome. He wants to buy the balloons, he wants to buy the sweets, he wants to go on the merry-go-round, he wants everything that he sees. But as soon as he gets separated from his father and mother, all he can think of is his father or his parents, and even when other people try to take his mind off the lost parents and they offer him sweets and they offer him rides, he is not interested in anything, and all he wants is his parents. So this child can sort of depict, or he can stand as a symbol for mankind who, when he or she loses his spiritual moorings, loses all interest in life, and only a connection back to the spiritual master can satisfy him. See? So there are various interpretations of this seemingly very simple story. Similarly, the second story that we've taken up, A Cup of Tea by Catherine Mansfield, presents a slice of life and deals with the emotions of the protagonist. Like I told you before, the protagonist in this is no larger than life heroine of noble character and noble emotions. She is a very down-to-earth, Rosemary Fell is a down-to-earth woman with all the petty jealousies, with all the petty problems, with all the petty insecurities that you and me can face in any situation. And that is why it becomes very easy to identify with Rosemary Fell. Alright, so she is basically a common person, and when you approach the story, keeping in mind the anti-hero, anti-protagonist characteristics that I'm talking about, you will see that all of them can be traced in Rosemary Fell. So this is what I'm basically getting at, because basically the true aim of education is to expand your awareness, to widen your perceptions, to broaden your horizons, and to make you see newness in the seemingly ordinary situations of life. And you must realize that there are no absolute truths in life. There are no set solutions. It all depends on your perspective, on what you choose to interpret the stories that you are reading with, and that is basically the true aim of education. After that, we come to O. Henry's story, After 20 Years, which is a gripping story of suspense, and it has a sting in the tail. Like I told you about open-ended narrations, this too is, although it's not open-ended, but there is a sting in the tail, so there is no neatly tied up ending that traditional stories had. And it's towards the end when the reader gets to know that Jimmy, whom the other character is waiting for, is actually the policeman. It's a very interesting story. I sincerely recommend it to you, and you must read this. Of course, the plot is more or less traditional. The chronology of events goes in a linear fashion, but what is very exciting is the sting in the tail ending. Now, the fourth story, Javni, has a more straightforward chronology. But even here, what you have to bear in mind is that on the surface of it, it is a story of Javni, again an anti-hero in the sense that we are used to. But what happens is that this story by Raja Rao depicts, and a very realistic depiction is given of India in perhaps the 1930s. You know, this was the time when the social reforms in India were taking place, when the transitional phase had come about, and the young class of people who were getting educated were questioning things like caste system, untouchability, and these kind of phenomena were being questioned by these people. And so, on one level, the story reflects the India of the 1930s, and on another level, it is about this anti-protagonist, Javni, and it is a very realistic picture of how the downtrodden were treated in those days, and it's a very evocative kind of a story, and it's a must read. So you must go through this story, all right? And it's a very realistic picture of how the poor people were treated in those days, how they were given food to eat in the cowshed. Even though they worked in the homes, they were not given the privilege of sitting inside the houses and eating. So these are basically some of the things that you must keep in mind when you approach these 4 stories. Now, to conclude, let me sum up what I've talked about. I've spoken about some of the traditional characteristics of a short story. I've spoken about the basic elements of a short story. I have also explained to you the drastic innovations that have come about in the form of this prose form, short story. And I have spoken to you about the style and the theme of short stories which have undergone dramatic changes. And of course, I've told you that basically the fundamental aim is to broaden your horizons, to challenge the way you look at things, and to approach literature in this way. And I would like to reiterate that you must go through Unit 14 of Block 4, because all these things that I have spoken about have been dealt with in a very comprehensive manner in this block, and it will really serve your purpose to go through this block. All right. And once you have an idea of the essential characteristics of a short story and the elements at the back of your mind, you would have a certain framework within which you can place any study of literature that you wish to undertake. Okay. And you will find, as you go on to reading any prose, or even for that matter any poetry or drama, you will find that subconsciously you will start applying all these characteristics and elements to whatever you read, and that will enhance your enjoyment of whatever you read, and you will basically be able to give a critical appreciation, or you would be able to analyze whatever you have read, and that is the difference between merely reading a piece of literature or studying it. And of course, that is a lovely way to function for any student of literature, isn't it? Okay. To sum up, I would only like to say that the study of literature involves not only enjoyment, but also a great deal of awareness. And this stems from our participation in the human experience. And of course, this can get highlighted by the use of language and literary devices in various ways. Therefore, we must be able to understand these devices in order to fully enjoy the complete range that any form of literature, whether it is a short story, whether it is a novel, whether it is the essay or biography or autobiography, these are the various forms that we spoke to you about in this course, we have spoken to you about. So, in order to enjoy the basic aesthetics of all these forms, you must bear in mind the framework that I have spoken about. All right. With this, I come to the end of my lecture. There has been no response from the study centers, so I hope this lecture did reach out to the students for whom it was meant. With that, I conclude this day's session. Thank you so much. Goodbye and good luck.